Hi everyone, and welcome to the session of the PhenoLab. Today it's my pleasure to welcome Professor Claire Petitmengin. I apologize for my bad French accent. And Claire is a professor at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. After studies in Buddhist philosophy and 10 years of experience in information system design, Claire Petitmengin completed a PhD thesis under the supervision of Francisco Varela at the École Polytechnique in Paris on the subject of lived experience that accompanies the merge of an intuition. She is presently Professor Emerita at the Institut Minet Télécom and member of the Archive Author at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris. Her research focuses on the usually unrecognized dynamics of lived experience and micro-phenomenological methods, enabling us to become aware of it and describe it. She studies the epistemological conditions of these methods, as well as their contemplative, educational, therapeutic, and artistic applications. The title of the talk she's going to present today is What Becomes of the Epoche in Micro-phenomenology. Thank you very much, Claire, for accepting my invitation. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Francesca, and thank you, Prisca, for inviting me to the PhenoLab. I'm very happy to be with you. Today, this afternoon, this morning, I don't know where you are.
Yeah.
So
now I need to.
What I've been trying to do since I started my thesis under the supervision of Francisco Varela, who initiated this approach, is to contribute to the development of a phenomenological practice, an empirical, concrete, or experiential phenomenology. Which took the name of micro-phenomenology. So the micro-phenomenological method relies on an interview method, which makes it possible to collect rigorous and fine-grained descriptions of a moment of experience. This interview method is an adaptation to research of the entretien d'explicitation created by the French psychologist Pierre Vermersch for educational purposes. It has been complemented by an analysis method aiming at identifying from a corpus of micro-phenomenological descriptions, possible structural regularities of the type of experience under studies. So for those of you who don't know at all the micro-phenomenological method, here is a brief synthesis of the micro-phenomenological interview process. So after an interview contract, aiming at defining the framework, the objective, the principles, and the confidentiality of the interview. So step one, the next step of the interview consists in choosing or eliciting the singular experience to be described. The experience can be elicited, triggered just before the interview. It can also be a past experience, which may have been lived even a long time ago. In both cases, the third step of the interview consists in inviting the interviewee to presentify or evoke this past experience by helping her to retrieve its sensory context, just as the odor and taste of the Madeleine enabled Proust to recall very precisely one scene and then whole chapters of his childhood. In the evocation state, the past situation becomes more present for the interviewee, than the interview situation. This evocation state is characterized by precise objective clues, such as the break of eye contact, the slowing down of verbal flow, the use of the present tense, and the use of co-verbal gestures, for example. Once the evocation is stabilized, the next step of the interview consists in helping the interviewee provide a coarse description of the temporal unfolding of the experience. The interview is then an iterative process consisting in choosing a phase of the experience and helping the interviewee refine its diachronic description, that is the description of its unfolding in time, or the synchronic description of this moment of experience, that is the description of the experiential landscape at this particular moment. For example, the mode of attention which is mobilized at that instant of experience, or the sensory modalities that are present at that moment. The expertise of the interviewer consists in drawing the interviewee's attention towards elements of experience which may have stayed unnoticed as the initial moment, through questions which are at the same time very precise, very focused, but non-inductive, such as, when you did that, what did you do? Very simple questions. The resulting description at the end is very fine-grained. An hour of interview usually allows the description of a few seconds of experience. That is why this interview method is called the micro-phenomenological interview. So this interview method is complemented by an analysis method, enabling the researcher to identify the diachronic and synchronic specific structures of a singular experience under the form of a network of descriptive categories, and the comparison of several specific structures makes it possible to identify possible generic structures of the type of experience being studied. So after it's a very, very brief overview of the method. My objective today is not to present it in all its details, but to focus on a particular issue. Given the importance of the epoche in phenomenology, since it is the founding act of the classical phenomenological approach, I would like to try to answer the question, what becomes the epoche in micro-phenomenology? My approach will be very concrete, as usual. I won't discuss the different conceptions of the epoche in the main figures of phenomenology. It's not at all the goal of this short presentation, but I will try to check if something like the epoche occurs in the very concrete process of exploration of experience that microphenomenology offers. I'm going to present a work in progress, a set of hypotheses born from the microphenomenological exploration of different types of experiences, and hypotheses intended to be confirmed, invalidated, or refined by further investigations. So I will start from the observation on which many phenomenologists agree today, that there are two interpretations of the epoche in classical phenomenology. There is the light epoche. In this first interpretation, the epoche consists in suspending one's preconceptions and beliefs about experience, which conceal the experience itself. So I will call this interpretation the light epoche, which doesn't mean that this suspension is something easy to do, of course. In the second interpretation, the epoche consists in suspending a particular belief, our implicit and fundamental belief that things exist a part of our consciousness of them. I will call this suspension the radical epoche. My question becomes now, are these acts part of the micro-phenomenological method? If so, what means does the method use to elicit them, to trigger them? And what is the effect of these acts? What do they enable us to discover? So in the light epoche, in the light interpretation, the epoche consists in letting go one's preconceptions and beliefs about experience, which conceals the experience itself. This means that to become aware of our experience, we must first abandon the representation we make of it, to which we usually hold very firmly. Just as someone who spontaneously draws a table, as he knows it is rectangular, must first abandon this representation to be able to see the table as it really appears to her or him. That is like a distorted parallelogram. So, I'm sorry. How does the micro-phenomenological interview help interviewees abandon their beliefs and preconceptions about the experience being described? The first mean used by the interview method is to focus on a singular experience. No one has an experience in general. The premise of the method is that only the exploration of a singular concrete experience, precisely located in space and time, makes it possible to leave the conceptual level, that is the expression of preconceptions, representations, generalities, and beliefs about the experience, in order to become aware of the experience itself, of what is actually lived. The first stage of the interview is therefore to invite the interviewed person to choose and to explore a singular experience. However, most of the time, the agreement on a singular experience to explore doesn't prevent the interviewee from quickly deviating towards the expression of generalities, judgments about the experience she is exploring. Pierre Vermersch created a map of the domains of verbalization that he called the satellite dimension of experience. The role of the interviewer is to identify in which domain the interviewed person is at any given moment. And each time she deviates towards satellite dimensions, to gently but firmly bring her back to the singular experience which is being described. Another possible device consists whenever the interviewee use an abstract word likely to convey an implicit preconception or representation, in formulating a question to help him discover the concrete experience and notably the concrete action, which may be hidden behind this abstract word. For example, if the interviewee says, I experienced a resistance, which we consider as an abstract word, the interviewer will reply, take your time to let the moment where you experience this resistance come back. At that moment, how do you know that you are resisting? Or at that moment, what do you do to resist? So it's a way of désabstractiser, je ne sais pas, I don't know, well, you understand what I mean, I hope. So, first, before addressing exploring this radical epoche, I would just say that where do preconceptions and beliefs that veil experience come from? It is a question I would like now. So the micro-phenomenological practice clearly shows that preconceptions originate in the lack of contact with experience. And this lack of contact arises from the absorption of attention into the object of experience, to the detriment of the experience itself. So this observation, on which I'm going to come back, allows me to address the second interpretation of the epoche. So the radical epoche, in this second interpretation, the epoche is more radical in the sense that it consists in suspending the preconception that underlies our very way of relating to the world. That is our implicit and fundamental belief in the existence of an objective world, independent of our experience. That a belief that Husserl called the natural attitude. So the radical epoche consists in bracketing or suspending this belief in order to go back to the thing themselves. It is the starting point, the preliminary step of the phenomenological endeavor to identify the structures of our relationship to the world. However, it turns out that in the classical phenomenological tradition, many pages have been written to try to define the epoche conceptually, but very little has been said about how this suspension is performed, about the acts that this practice involves. Moreover, there are very few descriptions of the origin of the natural attitude, which remains the greatest of all enigma for phenomenologists. So, the principles of the micro-phenomenological process are the following. Micro-phenomenology starts from the observation that a large part of our experience escapes us, remains unnoticed or unrecognized. This blindness to experience seems to originate in the absorption of attention into the object or content of experience. I will give a few examples in a minute. This absorption into the object, while concealing the experience, generates mistaken representations, preconceptions, which themselves contribute to concealing experience. One of these preconceptions is that of an objective world independent of the mind. To neutralize preconceptions, any preconceptions, it is therefore necessary to recognize the unrecognized part of experience, to become aware of it. And this recognition supposes a concrete gesture consisting in releasing the absorption into the object of experience. So, for example, while talking to you right now, I'm absorbed into the content of the ideas that I am trying to express. this absorption creates a sort of narrow attentional tunnel, which has the effect of concealing, for example, the rapid succession of inner images, light emotions that accompany my talk, or also the pre-verbal thread of thought on which I rely to express my ideas, or even the gestures I make while talking. Moreover, usually, I'm not even aware that I'm unaware of something. As a result, I have only a very scanty understanding of my own expressive processes. I wouldn't be able to describe them in detail. And if I tried, I would probably describe what I learned about this process, the process of expression, the preconceptions and belief I have about it, but not how I experience it. To become aware of it, I would need to release the absorption of my attention into the content of my ideas. More generally, becoming aware of an experience requires releasing the absorption into the object of experience, or the tension towards the object of experience. This releasing is a very specific gesture, of which I tried to collect descriptions. Not only me, but my colleagues and me. So it has been described to us as follows. First, releasing the focus on the object of experience requires opening up the attention scope. This opening up is often described as fostered by a shift of the area usually perceived as the source of attention, the head, the eyes, towards the body. A shift itself initiated by a subtle adjustment towards the back of the skull, which has been described to us often, surprisingly. Here is a description of this tiny movement. At this moment, I go down into my body. How do you go down into your body? Typical micro-phenomenological question. I go towards the back of my head. I move the center of gravity of my attention from the front of my head towards the back of my head. So it's part of a long description of this movement by Liz. So this tiny adjustment fosters a widening of attention. From focused, attention becomes panoramic, peripheral, diffuse. This open and embodied attention allows a receptive attention disposition. Instead of going towards the landscape, the sound, the person, let's say, for example, instead of exploring it in a frontal, active, and deliberate way, instead of touching it, you let yourself be touched by it. You let it come. You make yourself available to it. It's about welcoming the experience, allowing oneself to be impregnated by it. Wow. Sorry, I have a problem with my mouse. Okay. May I share a nice description of this receptive attention mode given by Monique? Monique was contemplating the yellow flowers of a garden one day in April. Suddenly she said, I felt what it is actually to see. To see isn't casting your gaze towards something, projecting it, holding it out, but really it's letting the thing imprint itself in you. You are completely passive and you let the color, the landscape come to you. You aren't going to look for it, you welcome it. You're there and you receive it. and you have the impression that the color or the landscape imprints itself inside you. So, to sum up, specific attentional acts help releasing the straining towards objects of experience in order to allow the recognition of the experience concealed by this tension. In the micro-phenomenological interview, these acts are fostered by the very structure of the interview process. The first key to the interview is indeed to describe a particular past experience, which the interviewer helps the interviewee to replay, reenact, presentify. In the initial situation, the tension towards a goal to achieve, for example, sharing my ideas, or towards an object to identify, conceals the experience itself. But in the context of an interview, the goal has already been achieved. The object has already been identified. The interviewee, released from the tension towards the objective or object, is able to adopt much more easily than in the initial experience the receptive attitude needed to recognize the unrecognized dimension of experience, the unnoticed dimension of experience. Making an effort to remember the experience could, however, introduce a new tension, which would, once again, conceal its unrecognized dimensions. But it turns out that the technique used in the interview, the evocation, is based on a form of recollection that is involuntary. The memory cannot be targeted intentionally and directly, but it pops up unexpectedly. All that it is possible to do is to encourage the spontaneous emergence of a memory by rediscovering the sensory context of the experience and adopting a receptive mode of attention. A receptive mode which is precisely the condition of emergence into awareness of the unrecognized dimension of experience. This receptive attention is aroused in the interview by very specific interventions, such as the following one. I suggest, if you agree, that you take the time to let this moment, this sensation, this action, come back. So each word is important in this sentence. The words "take the time to" are notably important because they authorize an absence of immediate response, and therefore the time of silence, of latency, which is necessary for the emergence of the memory. They divert the interviewee from the temptation to fill this silence hastily with something known and not lived, with the expression of knowledge about the experience, which would once again be superimposed on it. The slowing down of the verbal flow and the presence of moments of silence are then clues that the person is in this waiting position. By agreeing to adopt this receptive disposition, the interviewees give up the control they think they have over their experience and take the risk of discovering a dimension of themselves that they do not know yet. In order to enter this state of vulnerability and to do this intimate work in the presence in the interviewer, it is essential that they feel the latter totally present, attentive, and benevolent. The relationship of trust that is created is thus one of the keystones of the interview. So what is the effect of releasing the absorption into objects, thanks to these acts of attention, these movements of attention? So amazingly, releasing the tension towards contents or objects of experience has the effect of dissolving the structures that we consider as the most solid and the most essential to experience. The separations we usually perceive between body and mind, between inner and outer space, and between sensory modalities. So I will address these 3 points successively. The softening of the separation usually perceived between body and mind is well illustrated by the experience of ideation. How does an idea come to us? Although the emergence of an idea is luckily a very common experience, we know little about it. Indeed, when an idea appears, even a scientific idea that has important implications in our daily life, all the interest usually focuses on its content and the exploration of its consequences. Very little attention is paid to the experience of its emergence, to the process which made the discovery, for example, possible. The reduction of the idea to its content expressed in verbal form and the lack of awareness of its genesis has the effect of reducing our understanding of ideation to a disembodied cognitive mechanism. We represent our ideas as thought processes taking place in a mind localized in the head and separated from the body. The collection of meticulous descriptions of the process of emergence of ideas paints a very different picture. This exploration shows that in the experience of ideation, the distinction that we believe we perceive between mind and live body dissolves. According to many testimonies, before an idea is expressed in verbal, mathematical, pictorial, or musical form, it appears in the form of a direction, a movement, a rhythm, not pertaining to any particular sensory modality, but nevertheless subtly felt. For instance, a well-known scientist that you will probably recognize described the emergence of his main idea as follows. For all these years, he said, there was a feeling of direction, of heading straight for something concrete. It's of course very difficult to express this feeling in words, but I had it in a sort of overview and in a certain way visually. So the space where an idea unfolds, even an apparently very abstract one, such as the theory of relativity, far from being purely conceptual and disembodied, takes the form of a landscape, which a very specific texture, contrasts of densities and intensities, in which the rigid separation that we usually establish between body and mind vanishes. Even when the idea has been expressed, this gestural and quivering dimension remains. Beneath concepts, it seems to constitute the very dimension of meaning. Just checking the time. I'm sure. Relaxing the tension towards the object of experience has also the effect of softening the border usually felt between inner and outer space, of making it more permeable. This characteristic is particularly well evidenced in perceptual processes, when the tension towards the perceived object releases. For example, when a sound occurs, my attention usually focuses on the physical event at the origin of the sound. In a fraction of a second, I recognize the sound as the song of a blackbird on the plum tree. This focused attention has an impact on the structure of my lived space. The object is out there, far from me who am here. This mode of attention, of listening more precisely, this mode of listening creates a distance, a separation between the perceived object and the perceiving subject. But when a sound occurs, instead of going in search of the sound, listening out towards it, I can also make myself receptive to it. I can let the sound come to me. I can let myself be touched by it. Listening like this, a little as we listen to a piece of music, creates a sort of rhythmic attunement between bodily space and outer space, which has the effect of softening the limit between the two spaces. The felt song is not over there in the throat of the bird. It's not here in me either. It resonates in a space where the boundary between here and there vanishes. In visual perception too, loosening the tension towards the object has the effect of weakening the bodily boundaries. Suppose, for example, that during a walk in the countryside, a bend in the path reveals a new landscape. Immediately, I recognize its elements. Birch trees, a stream, which I locate over there at a distance from myself, whose point of view is located here at eye level. But there is another way of looking. Instead of recognizing objects over there, I can let colors, shapes, movements, sounds come to me. I can let the atmosphere, the particular rhythm that emanates from the landscape permeate me, a little like a perfume. In this experience, the landscape is no longer an expanse that presents itself to me as a beautiful spectacle. It's no longer looked at but felt. And this feeling dissolves the boundary between it and me. I had a description of this experience, but I am going to skip it for time reasons. This sense of dissolution of bodily boundaries is itself associated with a transformation of the feeling of individual identity, which becomes lighter and may even disappear. This weakening is very obvious in the emergence of a new idea again. In this instant, the sense of agency, that is, the sense that I am the one who is generating the idea, is altered. The interviewed subjects do not say, I have an idea, but an idea is coming to me. Even the sense of ownership, that is the feeling that this idea is my idea, fades. Interviewees do not even say, an idea is coming to me, but there is an idea. The experience is not felt as being immediately mine, as being my experience. It's not felt as personal. This is also true of an emerging sensation. Like the idea, the sensation emerges in a space which is neither subjective nor objective at the very initial moment of its emergence. When the tension towards the object releases, it happens that the distinction usually perceived between sensory modalities also becomes more permeable. Indeed, the vocabulary used to describe the texture of these feelings often calls simultaneously on several sensory registers. of this or of an emerging feeling. For example, the feeling of direction that led Einstein to the theory of relativity that he described in the sentence I quoted a minute ago. So this feeling of direction seems to be both kinesthetic, a feeling of direction, and visual. I had it in a sort of overview, in a certain way, visually. In a different domain, the psychoanalyst Theodor Reik describes the subtle inner sensations that guide him in the course of a therapeutic session, sometimes as visual. He describes them as nuances and fleeting psychic shadows, sometimes as auditory, as almost imperceptible half tones, sometimes as tactile, as little incoherencies, slight irregularities that were not visible but were perceivable to touch, as when a hand slides carefully and softly over a fabric. And sometimes as kinesthetic. It described these feelings as tiny subterranean variation. So these feelings do not fall within a specific sensory modality. They are, strictly speaking, neither images, nor kinesthetic or tactile sensations, nor sounds. However, they have specific, precise sensory submodalities, such as intensity, direction, and rhythm, which have the characteristic of being transmodal. Unlike, for example, temperature, which is specific to touch, and color, which is specific to vision, intensity, direction, and rhythm are not specific to a particular sense, but can be transposed from one sense to another. In this dimension of experience, the border usually perceived between the different sensory registers dissolve somehow. In sum, releasing the tension towards contents or objects of experience enables us to come into contact with a more subtle dimension of experience. A dimension where the separations we usually perceive between body and mind, between inside and outside, and between subject and object, and between sensory modalities fade or even vanish. However, amazingly, this gesture of releasing does not only make us aware of this subtle dimension of experience, but this gesture subtilizes experience. This subtilization of experience may occur in other practices. For example, in the practice of the focusing method, or in some meditative practices, where this process is not fostered by evocation, but by different skillful means. Progressively, over the course of the practice, the experience of the practitioner becomes lightens. To say it differently, this subtilization or lightening process does not result from reorienting attention from a layer of solid and coarse phenomena towards a layer or more subtle or elusive phenomena, layers which would be coexistent, ready to be accessed. It's different. The very gesture of releasing the tension on the perceived phenomena attention represented here by an arrow, softens its solidity, its density, makes it lighter. And in the same way, in the same movement, also softens its separation from a solid perceiving subject. Releasing the grasping on the object subtilizes at the same time the object and the subject poles. The subject is represented by this circle in the middle, and the word by the big circle. So this gesture of releasing the tension of the object subtilizes both poles, in fact. In other words, what micro-phenomenological investigations highlight is that the structure of our lived space is not pre-given, but is shaped by micro-attentional acts. In this dynamic perspective, we don't have two poles, the subject pole and the object pole, but a spectrum of increasing or decreasing density of the subject-object couple. Said differently, we don't have a pre-given world made of different layers of more or less subtle phenomena and different modes of attention, giving us access to these different layers. But our very attention mode solidifies or subtilizes the world. It's interesting to note that our vocabulary has no word to name this process of solidification or subtilization of the word, at least to my knowledge. So at this point of in our investigations, what elements of an answer can we provide to the question but what becomes of the radical epoche in micro-phenomenology? The radical epoche, that is the suspension of our fundamental belief in the mind-independent existence of the world. So it's a huge question. It's a huge question. Of course, the epoche is a huge question, very difficult. And I've been asked this question, I tried to find elements of an answer, and here are a few elements of answer. So the fundamental gesture that underlies the experiential approach of micro-phenomenology is not a conceptual gesture of suspending the belief in the reality of external objects. It is a concrete gesture of releasing the tension towards objects that is fostered and accompanied very precisely by the interviewer in the interview process. This gesture of releasing results in the lightening of the object as well as that of the subject. That is, in the subtilization of the subject-object dyad. So it's not a gesture of suspension. There is no but a process of subtilization. So I think the word epoche is not well adapted to describe this process. And this gesture doesn't initiate the phenomenological process, but it is carried out again and again during the process. And its full realization, it can happen, would mark the end of the process rather than its beginning. I think I am going to stop there. Thank you very much for your attention.